Hello, and welcome to this episode of What Will I Be When I Grow Up? My name is Cass, and we're doing things a little differently today. Instead of our usual format, we'll be covering questions submitted by our very own audience. Our guest today is Dr. John Brown, the head of Department of Clinical and Biomedical Sciences, as well as an associate professor of neurophysiology at the University of Exeter. He is interested in cognitive dysfunction in neurological diseases such as Alzheimer's and frontotemporal dementia arising from changes to neuronal networks. Welcome, John. We're happy to have you on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you. Great to be here. Thanks, Cass.
Great. Let's jump in, shall
Sure.
we? Okay. I thought we could start with you telling us a bit about your research and your teaching. What is your primary research focus in neuroscience and what drew you to this area?
Sure. I guess I started by getting really interested in how this big mush of tissue in your head, how that forms all of your memories and your personality and allows you to move around and allows you to sort of become who you are. So that was really my starting point, was how does the brain store all the information that makes you who you are? So when I was at university, I studied neuroscience and became really interested in a process called synaptic plasticity. So that's basically where these connections between nerve cells changes their strength. So they get stronger or get weaker, and that's thought to relate to learning and memory. So that was really kind of my starting point of the things I really got interested in. So then when I started my PhD, after I finished my undergraduate degree, I started working in a lab that was also in the pharmaceutical industry. Actually, it was in GlaxoSmithKline. So that was kind of one of the avenues in which you can take when you do a degree in neuroscience. And I was doing my PhD at the same time. And that laboratory at GlaxoSmithKline was really interested in Alzheimer's disease. And particularly, they were interested in how this form of synaptic plasticity, this change in the synaptic strength, how that gets affected in Alzheimer's disease. Because this synaptic plasticity, these synapses are thought to be one of the first things that goes wrong in Alzheimer's disease. So that's really where I started from. So that thinking about how Alzheimer's disease affects these synaptic connections in the brain.
I see. Okay. And how does your research in particular contribute to the overall understanding or treatment of Alzheimer's, for example?
Sure. So I think as I kind of progressed through my career, I started thinking a little bit beyond these kind of small synaptic connections I talked about, and started to think about how this might affect behavior in general. And in particular, I started to think about how it affects spatial memory. And that was kind of really that was where something that really fascinated me, because one of the early symptoms of Alzheimer's disease is basically patients will sort of leave their home, somewhere they've known for 20, 30, 40 years, and then immediately get lost. So how is this happening? How are they just people who've been living in one place for 40 years or something? How are they suddenly getting lost in these really familiar environments? So what I started to do was look at some of the brain mechanisms that underpin neurological disease, and particularly Alzheimer's disease, and particularly relating to this spatial memory formation, memory.
What was the, I guess, general understanding of it before?
Yeah. So we understood that people with Alzheimer's disease, were getting lost. We understood that, and we understood that their spatial memory was impaired. But what we didn't really understand is why that was. So what my research has been doing in the last few years has been to record from particular brain regions, in particular regions of the brain that are associated with mapping your environment. So if I was to record from your hippocampus, which is
wow.
Yeah. Don't worry, I'm not going to do it. But if I were, you would have these particular neurons, these particular brain cells, which fire tiny little electrical signals when you're in one particular location in space. So you would have one particular brain cell that's firing when you're sitting there, but if you moved over to the other side of the room, another neuron would fire, and then another neuron would fire over there, and so on. And what these spatial maps do is they act like little mini GPS signals, depending on where you happen to be. So one cell will fire there, one cell will fire there, and so on. And that helps create this sort of mental map of
I
the whole
see.
of the whole environment.
See.
So what I started to do about sort of 10 years ago now, we published this work, or eight to 10 years ago, we started to look at what happens to those little GPS signals, those little blue dots. If you imagine you get up, Google Maps or something,
Yeah,
you
right.
would see those little blue dots. And it turns out that those little blue dots actually are much bigger in Alzheimer's disease.
Oh,
So
really? Okay.
what that means is that your GPS signal, if you like, is weaker. So because
okay.
because if you imagine you've got a little blue dot, you know exactly where you are within a few meters.
I see.
If you've got a big blue dot on your
Oh,
iPhone, you know where you are within,
right.
I don't know, within
Larger radius of
a
error.
larger radius. Yeah. So you don't know. So you don't know where you are. You don't have as
Mm.
accurate spatial information. So that's really where we've started to contribute to the understanding of Alzheimer's disease and how that goes wrong and how this spatial mapping goes wrong in diseases like Alzheimer's.
I see. Okay. And are there any real world applications to your research that you see or maybe excite you right now? I'm thinking that could be in policy, that could be in treatment, or the clinical practice.
Sure. So I think, what a lot of the work I do is kind of, although it's work on Alzheimer's disease, it's fairly blue skies in a sense. It's kind of, it's
see.
quite exploratory.
Mm.
But more recently, what we've been looking at is what different how do different cell types sort of connect into the hippocampus, which is this region with these sort of GPS dots. And it turns out that some cell types that connect into this region don't work as well as other cell types. So other cell types seem to be working fine, whereas a region in the entorhinal cortex, which connects into there, those connections aren't working very well. So in terms of real world application, if we can change, or if we can sort of improve the connections between this entorhinal cortex and the hippocampus, perhaps using particular pharmacological agents, then we can maybe work to improve those particular cell type inputs into the hippocampus and maybe make these blue dots a little bit smaller and a little bit more accurate. So it's quite theoretical at this stage.
Right. Yeah. Because I can't imagine like a patient with Alzheimer's coming in and like how would that?
Well, I guess because one of the early symptoms of Alzheimer's disease is this wandering and getting lost, and actually it's actually one of the most distressing symptoms for patients because they're fine, and because it's a very early symptom, they're fine. They kind of wander off, and then they're suddenly getting lost. So if we can develop a therapy which improves people's spatial navigation by affecting different cell types, then you can start to treat that sort of those early symptoms of Alzheimer's disease.
I see.
So I'll be completely, I'll hold my hands up. We don't have it. It's not a direct, the work I'm doing isn't directly impacting, the clinical practice right now, but in the future, it may
There's potential.
Yeah, there's a potential there to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very exciting.
Yeah.
Actually.
And that's one of the things about neuroscience, I think, is it's quite a young discipline in many ways. I mean, the term neuroscience only really sort of existed since the 1960s. So it's quite a young discipline. So a lot of the work that's kind of going on is still really at the early stages, but that's really why it makes it one of the most exciting areas to study and to work in.
Wow, really cool. My next question for you is, what are some advances in neuroscience that has helped humanity in ways that a layperson like myself wouldn't know or notice?
Okay, help humanity is a big question. I think some of the technology that's been developed in the recent years, again, has the potential to really help humanity. And I think it's a little bit. I could tell you about some things which are already happening and helping clinical practice already, and then I could tell you a little bit about some future things that might be coming on.
Right.
So, some of the things that there's already out there are things like MRI scanning. Now, that's in a sense is a real collaboration between physicists who sort of developed this technology and neuroscientists who then applied that to the brain. So MRI scanning, for those you don't know, are these brain scans which allow you to see in really fine detail the anatomy of your brain, but also not only the anatomy, but also how your brain is functioning. So this has really revolutionized neuroscience, actually, because previously you could only really look inside someone's brain, after
Cutting them open.
but yeah, after they were dead. So you could could take their brain open, or people who are having brain surgery, for
But
example.
that seems very risky when you don't know what you're getting into.
And no one volunteers for brain surgery unless you really need it, right? So,
yeah, for sure.
But actually, MRI is completely non-invasive, so you can look in quite fine detail now at the anatomy of someone's brain just by putting them in a scanner, and it's completely harmless. And they just walk out sort of half an hour later, and you can see the inside of their brain. But also you can see how their brain is functioning as you're doing certain tasks. Now, that's not everything, and the resolution that you can record someone's brain activity is still not great. You can't record what individual cells are doing,
right? But
you can record what individual regions are doing in terms of neuronal activity. But that's really exciting, and has revolutionized a lot of the ways we can diagnose neurological diseases and as well as psychiatric diseases as well. And it's there's more advances coming out all the time in that region, in that area.
I see. Very cool.
So that's a real world application. Perhaps some of the in the last sort of say 15 years or so, some of the really exciting works going on, and this is still very much at the sort of preclinical and sort of experimental stage, is using a technique called optogenetics.
Okay.
And this is thinking about something you've probably not heard of before. This is a really cool one. So what you can do with optogenetics is you can control the activity of individual populations of neurons using light.
Oh.
And that means you can turn particular types of neurons on or turn particular types of neurons off just by flashing lights at them.
Oh, wow.
Now, obviously, the way to do that is you have to put fiber optic cables into someone's head.
Right.
And we can't do this in humans yet. But it's a really, really exciting way of being able to not only dissect what's happening or dissect those neural circuits and understand how those neurons are behaving in during behavior and how they contribute to different sort of behaviors as well. But it has the potential to really revolutionize things like deep brain stimulation, which are currently being used for things like Parkinson's disease, for example. We can do that at a much more sort of fine scale and much more accurate way of doing it.
See. And how far out do you think this technology is from being mainstream?
I mean, you could do it now.
Would it be ethical too?
No, probably not. There'd be a whole lot of testing that needs to happen. But I think if we can develop a really good rationale for why you might want to do it, I don't think we're that far away from doing it, because deep brain stimulation is something that is used clinically. And deep brain stimulation is where you would have an electrode implanted in a particular region of your brain. That's really helpful for something like Parkinson's disease. So you can stimulate a particular region of the brain and it alleviates some of the symptoms of Parkinson's disease.
Oh, wow.
So there's no difference between having an metal electrode implanted in your brain versus having a fiber optic cable implanted in your brain. It's just there's some of the other bits that go alongside it might take a little bit longer to get ethical approval. But it's very, very, I think it's really exciting and really has the potential to really revolutionize how we treat all sorts of neurological and psychiatric disorders.
Very cool. I wanted to ask you about the topic of AI. Is there any convergence between neuroscience and AI models? Because AI is fundamentally being taught to mimic how we think. What do you think of that whole topic?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to start by saying I'm not an expert in AI. But in terms of convergence between neuroscience and AI, that's right. I mean, a lot of AI algorithms are based on neural networks and how they work. And at the start, I talked about the strengthening and weakening of synapses, these connections between brain cells. That's exactly how a lot of neural network-based AI algorithms work as well. This is strengthening and weakening of connections between nodes. So very much built on the concept of the brain. I think one of the really interesting things now about that convergence between AI and neuroscience is that although AI sort of developed from neuroscience, we're now taking AI and applying it back into our neuroscience, into
How so?
neuroscience. So, for example, with image analysis, in order to analyze sort of really complex images that we're getting from, for example, from these MRI machines, one of the ways we can do that is use machine learning and artificial intelligence to really detect, very small changes in images that you can't really pick out by eye very easily, but a computer can. If you can train a computer to monitor to record these, to look at these algorithms, or look at these images in a lot of detail. So we're then able to sort of take those AI algorithms that were developed from neuroscience and then apply them back to neuroscience. So it's almost like it's coming full circle in a way.
For sure. Yeah. And do you see any impact of AI on your particular research?
Yes. So I mean, again, we can use AI to pull out a lot of these small electrical signals I was talking about. It's a huge amount of data processing that's required to detect these small electrical signals. So increasingly, we're using detection algorithms, for example, that use machine learning to pull out this information, and it's a much more systematic and cleaner way of doing this analysis. We can actually pull a lot more data out of our recordings than we can than we can from just doing that manually. So yeah.
Okay, very cool.
Yeah.
You mentioned the the invention of MRI was sort of like a intersection between neuroscience as well as physics.
Yeah, and engineering actually.
And engineering. How do you approach interdisciplinary collaboration? Are there any fields that you think have the most potential to contribute to neuroscience?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, absolutely. Neuroscience in itself actually is a really interdisciplinary subject, because really when you say you're a neuroscientist, that can mean anything from you working at the level of molecules, so you're molecular neuroscientist, all the way up to looking at systems and circuits, sort of cellular neuroscientist, if you like, all the way up to looking at behavioral neuroscience. So that's really kind of verging on psychology, I guess. So in of itself, neuroscience is an interdisciplinary subject. I work with molecular biologists. I also work with behavioral biologists so that we can together sort of try and understand what's going on in the brain. In terms of sort of wider sort of interdisciplinary interactions, mathematicians. I work quite closely with mathematicians who can help us model what's going on in the brain in a way that I can't, because I can't do those. I can't do those sums.
Different skill set.
Exactly. So mathematicians are really important in helping us sort of analyze our data, but also kind of help us create new hypotheses based on mathematical models. Again, physicists really important in helping us develop, and engineers really important in helping us develop new technologies to not only understand the brain, but also come up with new ways of treating different diseases and new ways of new ways of working as well. So yeah, that's I mean, lots of disciplines really, but those ones really kind of stand out to me.
I see. Yeah. I mean, given the fact that neuroscience is so interdisciplinary, are there any specific skills or experiences you recommend for students interested in pursuing a career in neuroscience? There are different skill sets that we mentioned.
Yeah.
So are there any specific ones that would be particularly helpful for students to have?
So I think having I mean, in the end, it's a biological discipline. So having a really deep, abiding interest in biology, and obviously particularly the biology of the brain, is really helpful. It's not essential to have a sort of, say, a biology A level or biology IB to come and do that, say, at Exeter. But it is really helpful. I think from the point of view of the way we teach neuroscience at Exeter, we're open to sort of anyone who's got a sort of scientific understanding, as long as they've got an enthusiasm for neuroscience. We're keen to support them. I think increasingly those sort of coding and coding skills are really important across all biomedical sciences, actually, both neuroscience and sort of biomedical sciences more generally, because increasingly the data sets that we're working with are larger and they're more complicated, and we simply can't analyze them with sort of off-the-shelf tools. We need to generate our own algorithms and use our own analysis tools, which are emerging all the time. So having those computer coding skills is really helpful. Now, again, at Exeter, for example, we really pride ourselves in teaching our students this. And I think one of the few universities that really teach this to sort of early on in people's biomedical education. So I used to run a module called Coding for Medical Scientists, which is really teaching people without any background in computer coding at all, teaching them how to write and understand some basic computer code. So that's sort of one of the things that we're really trying to kind of drive forward actually at Exeter, because we think that's actually going to be really a skill set of the future.
Yeah. And is that something that potential employers would want or would find desirable in a graduate?
Absolutely. I mean, I think obviously, if you want to go into neuroscience research, then it's really helpful. But we also know that not everyone actually wants to go into neuroscience research when they leave. A lot of people want to go and do different sorts of career paths, and that's fine as well. But those skills are incredibly transferable. I've had students who have gone off in the past to go and work in sectors such as finance, or in journalism, or in public policy, all sorts of different fields, but they've all actually found that those coding skills have been really, really useful and actually all the transferable skills we teach at the university, all of those skills are really useful for a whole host of different careers.
Yeah. I think what Exeter seems to really offer students is a well-rounded education. I think that sounds really helpful. I think those are all my questions. But now I would like to do something a little fun.
Yeah.
It's time for our rapid fire round.
Great.
So basically, I'm just going to fire some questions at you. Just answer with the first thing that pops into your head. Does this sound okay?
Yeah, fine.
All right. First, what was your first job?
I was a paper boy, so I used to deliver newspapers to people.
Oh, so cute.
When I was about 13, cycling around my hometown at 6 a.m, dropping papers into people's letterbox for the grand total of £1 an hour.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, no, I was being really ripped off.
If you could only eat one food for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Well, it would probably be pizza, but then the rest of my life probably wouldn't be very long.
Yeah,
so,
not very nutritionally dense. Describe Malaysia in one word.
Friendly.
Would you ever appear on a reality TV show?
You would have to pay me a whole ton of cash to do that.
How much?
I think you'd have to be getting into the millions and that's millions of pounds.
Producers out there, just take note. Okay, and my last question is, what's one bucket list item you want to check off in 2024?
2024? Okay. I was going to say, because I've actually just ticked one off by coming to Malaysia for the first time.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Was that really on your bucket list?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, wow.
Never been to Kuala Lumpur, never been to Malaysia before. So yeah, I've kind of done it.
Oh my God. Wow. Overachiever.
Yeah.
All right. That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. And thank you so much, Dr. John, for chatting with me. It's been great.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.